Community Relations Council, CEPA Gallery, Daemen College, Galicia Jewish Museum, and made possible in part by the Buffalo Jewish Federation. Yom HaShoa, or Holocaust Remembrance Day, which begins tomorrow, Wednesday, April 7th, and ends in the evening on Thursday, April 8th, commemorates the 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust and honors the heroism of the survivors. It is a time to reflect, to remember, to share and learn from the unfathomable tragedy. There's a quote that I found that I'd like to share by Professor Ben Zion Denor. It was on the Yad Vashem website, posted in 1956, that he said, "If we wish to live and bequeath life to our offspring, if we believe that we are to pave the way to the future, then we must first of all not forget." Today's event serves to commemorate the lives that were lost, but it will also discuss the importance of teaching and educating on the Holocaust to ensure that the stories are shared with future generations so that we do not allow for the Holocaust to be forgotten and the stories to be lost. Our speakers today, all of whom are professionals specializing in photography and education on the Holocaust, will present on Holocaust photography and discuss the effect photographs have on memory, interpretation, and reality when teaching the Holocaust. Presenting first is Tomas Strug, followed by Robert Hirsch, and then Dr. Sean Kelly. Our program will end with a Q&A, so please feel free to send questions and comments through the chat during the presentation. And now I'd like to welcome our first speaker and introduce Tomas Strug. Tomas is the Deputy Director and Chief Curator of the Galicia Jewish Museum in Krakow, Poland. He has curated numerous exhibitions in Poland and abroad, including in the USA, UK, Germany, South Africa, and Lithuania. He specializes in photography exhibitions and is the curator and lead writer of the Photographs from Jewish Poland, an application created in 2020 to display the Jewish history in Poland through the pictures taken within the last 150 years. So welcome, Tomas. Thank you for joining us from Krakow today, and look forward to hearing you speak.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be a part of this panel. I really appreciate the invitation. Welcome, everyone. Today's event is mainly about Ross photographs from Łódź Ghetto, but I will start this panel, this event with two other photographers who were active in the Łódź Ghetto, in the Litzmannstadt Ghetto, and will tell you about Walter Gennewein and Mendel Grossman. Let me just share my screen. Okay. So this is a talk on Walter Gennewein and Mendel Grossman. I think that the reason for which I was invited here, one of the reasons for which I was invited here was an exhibition that the Galicia Jewish Museum in Krakow made some time ago in 2017. The exhibition was called Girl in the Diary, Searching for Rivka from the Łódź Ghetto. And it was based on a unique diary which was found in 1945 in Auschwitz, just after the Auschwitz was liberated. The diary was found by a Soviet doctor and taken with her deep into the Russian territories. And only decades and decades later, when her granddaughter discovered the diary, the researchers found out that the diary was written by a teenager, Rivka Lipschitz, a girl from the Łódź Ghetto. Studying the diary, working with the diary, many information was discovered about Rivka. Many information was discovered about her family, about her siblings, who were sent to death camp in Chełmno, about her parents, about her friends, about her teacher, about all the other girls that she was spending nights writing about in her diary. But we never found any photograph of Rivka. We never found or identified any photograph of her brother, her sister, her father, mother, her friends. And what we did with this exhibition and with this project is that we used photographs taken by 3 photographers who were operating in the Litzmannstadt Ghetto. photographs of Henrik Ross, who will be discussed later today, but also photographs of Walter Gennewein and Mendel Grossman. And I will be briefly introducing to you the work of Walter Gennewein and Mendel Grossman. They both shared the same area. They both were active in the Litzmannstadt ghetto, which here is marked on the map of the Łódź. It was changed. The city's name was changed to Litzmannstadt by Germans because this was the part of the Polish lands which was annexed to the Germany after the outbreak of the war, and the name was changed. There was 650,000 inhabitants of Łódź at that time. Almost 250,000 of them, or 230,000 of them, being Jewish. And very early, the ghetto in Łódź was established. It was established in February of 1940, and it was the longest running ghetto in Poland. It was only liquidated in August of 1944. And a part of this location in which they worked, Walter Gennewein and Mendel Grossman were as far apart as possible in terms of discussing the Holocaust photography. Walter Gennewein was Austrian. He was an ardent Nazi. He was a member of National Socialist Party in Germany. Mendel Grossman was a Polish Jew from Łódź. Walter Gennewein worked for the German administration of the ghetto. Not only worked for the German administration, he was a head of the ghetto's financial department. He was basically a chief accountant of the Łódź ghetto. Mendel Grossman, together with his family, was forced to relocate to the ghetto, and he was employed as a photographer by the ghetto statistic department, basically a department which was created by the Jewish administration of the ghetto, namely the Judenrat. Walter Gennewein was an amateur photographer. He never made money. He never worked as a photographer before the war, while Mendel Grossman worked as a photographer before the war. He was cooperating with Jewish theaters in Łódź. He was photographing for the theater. He was commissioned to publish a book. Just before the war, he was commissioned to publish a book portraying Jewish children of Łódź. This book was never published. Nevertheless, he decided to professionally be a photographer. Walter Gennewein is an example of a very rare case of photographs being taken in color during the Holocaust. There's just few photographers who were photographing the Holocaust in color, and Walter Gennewein is one of them. They were, in most cases, if not all the cases, Germans, because they had access to the most recent technology, in this case, the Aqua color film. Mendel Grossman was taking more traditional black and white photographs, in most cases illegally, using the materials and equipment in the department's supplies. These are those two photographers. On the left is Walter Gennewein, on the right is Mendel Grossman. I think these photographs somehow show these differences I just mentioned. On the left, we have a clerk, an accountant of the ghetto, who sometimes takes his camera out on the streets of the ghetto. On the right, we have this notorious photographer who spends days and nights either taking photographs or developing photographs, always asking for more film, always asking for more, or always seeking for more opportunity to take photographs. I will start with Gennewein, with the accountant. Which ghetto was a special one, if you can say something like that. It was running longer than other ghettos because, in fact, it was one large factory or a production facility who was making things. Jews were forced, it was labor camp, in fact. Jews were forced to make things for both German military and the civilians. And Gennewein, being an accountant and doing what he does, in most cases was showing the ghetto as a factory, the ghetto as a production facility, the ghetto as a place where things are being made so that they can be later used either by the military or by civilians in Germany. You can see the hints of the color in the slides, although they are not perfectly colorful, which is not case of being old. It's just case of the technology being not perfect at the time. And actually, there is a lot of correspondence between Genevine and Agfa when he complains about the quality of the colors that that he's able to achieve with the photography. But you have a hint of red, of yellow. So photographs like that are to be found within the archives of Walter Genevine. All kinds of factories, all kinds of workshops, all kinds of facilities that he photographed because it was a part of what he was doing. He was reporting about numbers. He was reporting about achievements of the Ghetto as a production facility. And he was sending on daily basis, not on daily basis, on monthly basis, on quarterly basis, on yearly basis, on all demand reports like this one. This is actual fragment of the one of the report that Genevine was sending. So production for Wehrmacht, strobe brights, more than 25 million meters, which translates into, I don't know, 80-ish million feet. Brushes, 59,000 pieces of brushes, suspenders, 416,000. Production for civilians, boys' jackets, boys' trousers, pairs of shoes, and so on and so forth. These reports, they are to be found in some archives. In Germany, they have pages and pages and pages of goods which were produced by the Jewish dwellers, Jewish population of the ghetto. At the same time, while Genevine was writing his reports, other clerk in his department would send reports which will say something like, this month we confiscated 800 kilograms of silver, which is being sent to Berlin, or this week we sent 22 crates of watches confiscated from the Jews of the Łódź ghetto. This is also something that Genevine was photographing and found interesting in terms of photography. This is actually inmates sorting the stuff which were taken from other prisoners. But also Genevine managed to capture what in the first draft of this presentation I called daily life in the ghetto, but it really wasn't a daily life in the ghetto. It was scenes from the ghetto. This is the title I gave it. These are photographs that he took while walking on the streets of ghetto, market scenes, like here and here, or streets in the ghetto. If you will take away the badges with the Star of David, it almost seems like scenes from the pre-war shtetl somewhere in Poland. There's hard to find any indication of actual atrocities taking place in the ghetto. Sometimes he managed to photograph such things like distribution of bread or distribution of meat, but this was these were very rare examples of his photographs. In most cases, as I said, these were at scenes, a created reality framed by Genevine, with people standing, looking at him, being aware of him, being afraid of him, probably taken in the same manner like Genevine was standing, camera at his eye level, and the photographs being taken. There's just few photographs of the real atrocities, including the photographs of the deportation, but the whole collection is very difficult to find any hints of the actual things which were happening in the ghetto. There was a film produced about Genevine, or not about Genevine. It was produced using the Genevine's photographs, and they were juxtaposed with the testimony of Alfred Mostowicz, a survivor of the Łódź ghetto. And in the opening of this film, produced in 1998 by Dariusz Oboński, Mostowicz says that the slides pictured the ghetto in Łódź, but it was not the ghetto from my memory, even though they show the same people, the same buildings, the same streets. Later, Mostowicz is asking, where should we seek the truth? Should we seek it in the photographs, in our memory? Should we seek it in the streets of the ghetto? Should we seek it in the cemetery? And I think that a lot of the ghetto from his memory would be found in the photographs of photographers like Gross, like Mendel Grossman and like Henry Gross. And I will tell you now about very briefly about Mendel Grossman, who I call the photographer in this presentation. Mendel Grossman was sent to the ghetto with his family, was forced to the ghetto with his family, with his mother, with his father, which are photographed here, with his two sisters, one of which is photographed here, with his nephews. His nephew is in the left corner of this photograph. So naturally, being a photographer, having camera on him all the time, trying to photograph everything, he was also photographing his family all the time. And there is quite a lot of photographs which survived of his family. He was obsessed with what is happening in the ghetto. He was obsessed with the people eating. He was photographing his family eating. We know from the all accounts of the ghetto, all the diaries from the ghetto, that the hunger was one of the biggest problem in the ghetto. So for Mendel Grossman, it was the act of eating was something he found worth photographing, and this is like obsession. He was photographing strange people eating. He was photographing people eating on the street. He found it as some sort of act worthy of being recorded. He photographed workers during the break. Of course, he photographed in the same places that Walter Gennewein was photographing. Ghetto was, as I said, one large factory, so he was photographing the workshops. He was photographing in different way than Walter Gennewein. Gennewein's photographs look the same. People are looking at him. People are afraid. Mendel Grossman was one of the Jews in the ghetto. He was almost transparent. He was there. He was photographing from different angles. He was standing on the chair. He was photographing from above. He was photographing while on his knee. These are completely different photographs showing the work of the Jews in the ghetto. This is actually a photograph taken on the street, which people are copying the announcement of the rations which will be given to them, food rations which will be given to them next week or next month or something later. If on the street, he also photographed different than Walter Gennewein. He was in the constant movement, and movement is visible in his photographs. Gennewein's photographs are still. Grossman's photographs are showing that something is happening in the ghetto. In most cases, this is a labor or seeking for the food or escaping, or like here on the right, is looking for anything to eatable in the ground in the ghetto, in the garden, in a place that's supposed to be a garden within the ghetto area. He was so dedicated to photography that actually Chaim Rumkowski, the famous head of the Łódź Ghetto administration, the Jewish Ghetto administration, the Judenrat, made this official note forbidding him to do any photographic work outside of his regular tasks. And his regular tasks was basically photographing the production, the items which were produced in the ghetto or produced in the ghetto, or to photograph, to make portraits for official document used by the ghetto ghetto dwellers. Also, the reason for that is that Gennewein was documenting the crimes. He was documenting, unlike the Walter Gennewein, he was documenting the crimes. He was having his camera hidden under his coat. He had holes cut in his pockets, and he was operating so that no one will see him. He was photographing executions. He was photographing deportations. He was photographing from afar. He was coming very close to the people who were photographed, almost as he wanted to record their faces and make them, stay, at least in photographs. In most cases, those people were sent straight to their deaths. He was photographing people incoming to the ghetto, transport incoming to the ghetto. He was photographing people going away to the death camps. He was photographing people crying. He was photographing children taken away from their parents. He was photographing parents taken away. He was photographing people writing the last words before being sent to their deaths. He was photographing all the time He was photographing constantly. He was made a photography his mission within the framework of his work in the ghetto and his activities in the ghetto. You remember this? You remember these differences like I showed you a couple of minutes ago. There was one more most important difference. Walter Genewein survived the war, and Mendel Grossman was murdered. Genewein, after the ghetto was liquidated in 1944, in August of 1944, went back to Germany. He was on trial. He was tried in 1947. Spent very brief time in prison. He was tried for getting rich by exploiting the Jews. His defense was that he bought all the things that he brought from Łódź, basically jewelry, watches, and stuff like that. Also, he had a bad health condition. He had diabetes, and on this basis, he was released. He died in 1974 in Salzburg. He was a respected citizen, and his collection surfaced only 13 years after he died in 1987. It was his slides, his photographs were found in an antique shop or a used bookshop in Vienna. Those slides were bought by the Jewish Museum of Frankfurt. Some years later, another portion surfaced in Bremen, and the other bit of his collection is being held at the United States Holocaust Museum in Washington. Most likely these were sold, both were sold by his family. So apparently he had them in his possession throughout the decades after the war. Never showed them to anyone, maybe but some family members, although we don't know that. But we know that he had them, he held to them. Mendel Grossman didn't survive. This is the photograph of his family taken before the war. On the left is his mother. She died in the ghetto of illness or starvation, as well as his father on the right here in 1942. This is his sister Feiga. She was sent to Auschwitz in 1944. She perished in Auschwitz. Mendel Grossman survived the ghetto and was sent to Germany, to a labor camp in Germany. And when the front was approaching the labor camp, when he was in, he was sent on another leg of the march of death, and he was shot en route to the other place on the 13th of April 1945, literally 7 days before the Germans surrendered in Europe. The only one who survived is his sister Ruśka. She was the one who helped to recover his photographs. His photographs were hidden before the liquidation of the ghetto in his apartment and a couple of other places in the ghetto. Unfortunately, the photographs, people say that there were 10,000 of them. The witnesses say there were 10,000 of them. Were sent to one of the kibbutz, to the kibbutz in Israel, and they were destroyed when Egyptians override the kibbutz in the Israeli War of Independence. And all we have really, all what is left are prints which he was making and giving away to his friends. So there is around 400 photographs which can be identified as made by Mendel Grossman, and we can only imagine what kind of photographs, what kind of images we would be able to look at, where if this 10,000 photographs that he took somehow survive. Yeah, so that's it from me. I think this was it.
Thank you, Tomas. So we're now going to move on to Robert Hirsch, who's presenting next. And it was honestly, I had worked with Bob a couple of years back. He exhibited at the JCC, and we've stayed in touch. And he had a recent exhibit at the CEPA Gallery, which I'm not going to speak too much about because I know he's going to touch base and talk a bit about it. But it had to do with photographs of Henrik Ross. And with our discussions and kind of seeing the photographs, that's kind of what spurred today's program. So I'm looking forward to seeing what Bob has put together with us. Bob is a local artist, curator, educator, historian, and author of numerous books and articles on photography. He is best known for his writing on color and digital imaging and about the history of photography. He has curated over 200 solo and group exhibitions. So, Bob, I will let you take it from here.
Thank you, Katie. And as part of the introduction, I do want to touch upon how I became part of today's presentation. And last fall, I did curate an exhibition at CEPA Gallery that was called Wild Things, Disturbing the Photographic Archive in the Time of a Pandemic. And that took place here at CEPA Gallery in Buffalo, New York. And the basic concept of the show explored how chance, nature, time, and the maker's hand can change how an image's meaning is altered as time progresses. And the show featured about 20 international artists, and they were all contemporary artists with the exception of Ross and Ruby Merritt, who was the project assistant for Wild Things and also the installer of the show. This had the great idea when the show concluded to donate the Ross prints that we had made, their facsimile prints, to donate them to the JCC in Buffalo. So that is how I came today to be discussing Ross. With that, I'm going to do a screen share as well, and I'm going to begin by just presenting some of the background about CEPA for people who aren't familiar with it. And I'm going to start this. So Henry Ross was born in Poland during 1910, and he died in Israel in 1991. Before World War II, he had been a sports photographer for a Warsaw newspaper. When the Lodz Ghetto was sealed by the Germans in May of 1940, Ross was forced to move into the ghetto and managed to get a job as one of the official photographers in the ghetto. Along with his colleague, Mendel Grossman, Ross made identity and propaganda photographs for the Department of Statistics in the ghetto, which made him a member of the Nazis' Judenrat, or Jewish Council. This practice, in which members operate as liaisons between the Jews and the Germans, dates back to the Middle Ages. In turn, this gave Ross access to a camera, film, and processing facilities. Hiding his camera underneath his coat, he would slightly open and reduce and release the shutter while his wife, Stefania, acted as a lookout. When the liquidation of the ghetto began in 1944, Ross and Stefania were ordered to stay behind and clean up the crime scene. And they managed to bury his archive and other ghetto records. Moisture caused half of his 6,000 negatives to be ruined or damaged. This unintentional physical destruction is a striking visceral memory or metaphor of the overwhelming suffered Jewish slaves. On the other hand, it also symbolically allows the images to achieve a transcendence into a spiritual realm, even as the ghetto world is outwardly defined by anxiety, mortality, and nullity. Philosophically,
Bob, excuse
yeah.
me. Are you meaning to be screen sharing right now?
Yeah.
Okay, I
It's
didn't want
not?
to get to, no. So if you can just try to screen share again.
Oh, okay.
It's okay. I just know you have some images for us to see. This is Ruby, our technical assistant over there.
Yeah.
There we go.
Oh, that's funny because it looked like it was sharing. All right.
Thanks,
Redo.
Ruby.
Sorry. All right. Well, you can back up and see what I was at least initially referring to about CEPA and the installation of the work as part of the Wild Things show. Anyhow, the circumstances under which the photographs were made, Ross's official job gave him special benefits and privileges. And these were not afforded to other people. And these were granted as long as these people were useful to the Germans. So there was a vast incongruity between the elite and those who had the skills that the Germans found useful. So the social structure of the ghetto in some ways was similar to the pre-ghetto life based on family history, connections, education, etc., which determine one's social bearing in the ghetto. There are still the haves and the have-nots. Regardless of the ghetto life, everyone was under extreme and brutal and traumatic circumstances. And everyone had to wear a Jew badge that was derived from medieval times when both Christians and Muslims decreed that Jews must wear articles of clothing that would set them apart and shame them for being different. Unofficially, Ross used his privileged position to clandestinely make photographs that juxtaposed the daily existence with people dying in the street of starvation, along with the ongoing deportation of children, the elderly, and the infirm. Eventually, everyone, including Mordechai Rumkowski, who was the head of the Nazis' Judenrat, all went to the gas. After liberation by the Russian army, many found Ross's behavior a form of collaboration in a similar manner as they did Romankowski. Did Ross's action of disobeying the German prohibition on taking photographs that were not officially approved and make him a collaborator, a survivor, a documentarian, a resistance fighter, or all of the above? Like Mendel Grossman's images, Ross's photographs depict familiar scenes of hunger, despair, and death. 20% of the ghetto inhabitants died of starvation. Of the over 200,000 people who passed through the ghetto's 2 square kilometers, less than 900 survived. Ross photographed ghetto workers who had to go barefoot while pushing fetal carts, a horrible and dangerous job that often led to death by typhus. He photographed scenes of misery near the ghetto prison, public hangings, the deportation of Jews to their deaths at the first Nazi German extermination camp. He photographed people writing their last notes, as has been mentioned, children behind chain link fence, and so on. And he also photographed in September of 1942 the first kind of mass deportation in which children who were under 10 years of age, anyone who was sick, anyone who was elderly, was deported because they had no labor value, and they were all immediately gassed. However, his collection also includes photographs that appear mind-boggling in the context of the Holocaust. Ross saw beauty among the suffering of the ghetto population. He photographed such scenes as birthday parties, children playing, and a couple kissing, in which context, photographs seem to predict and show people leading an ordinary life. Knowing that these pictures were taken in the midst of destruction, humiliation, starvation, and murder can initially seem can seem confusing. However, in hindsight, we can understand the struggle of the ghetto prisoners to affirm a semblance of a normal life as a form of defiance. Ross's photographs are a study in opposites, for they give the illusion that ghetto conditions were not so terrible. However, they are unrepresentative and stand in stark contrast to the reality of the majority of ghetto inmates. Such images predict a tiny minority of prisoners, more privileged Huguenots, and their children who lived under better conditions. It is unclear why Ross took these pictures and the relationship he had with the subjects. Was he paid? Was he friends with them? Or did he want to commemorate these everyday social interactions as a rebuke against the horror? Other shocking scenes that have been uncovered show a version of what we here in the States call cops and robbers, which was modified to Nazis and Jews, or ghetto policemen and Jews. And here children dressed up as SS or ghetto policemen and rounded up their playmates for deportation. And such images have been considered rather confounding. But it can be noted that such games assist children in learning about their environments. And in a sense, these kind of bizarro games could have helped these children cope with the reality of ghetto existence. Such pictures raise, many questions, and they were not made public until 1997, 6 years after Ross's death, when his son made the collection accessible for the first time. And they explain why Ross's archive was harshly judged and why Holocaust institutions were not initially interested in his work. His son recalled, quote, "He tried to get his pictures published in the 1950s, but no one wanted to know. The iconic pictures of the Holocaust were of atrocities. The message of these pictures was not so straightforward." At the close of night, an autobiographical account of the surviving German death camps, Elie Wiesel wrote, "For in the end, it is all about memory, its sources and its magnitude, and of course, its consequences. And drawing the conclusion, finally, that the best of us died." Ross's artless photographs, made without looking through a viewfinder, are reminders of the long, ugly history of anti-Semitism that dates back to Greece. The portrayal of Jewish ghetto life through the eyes of a professional Jewish photographer who recorded people and social interactions made under terrifying conditions. His visual record, I think, stands in defiance of the Nazis' goal of annihilating Jewish people and their culture. However, an exorcism of passing time was necessary before the value of Ross's contradictory work became apparent. Then, like smoldering ashes, they came roaring back. This arising led to Ross's harrowing testimony and his photographs being used in evidence in the 1961 Jerusalem trial of SS officer Adolf Eichmann, the implementer of the final solution. With the benefit of reflection, Ross acted as a classic photographic journalist, employing the photograph as a witness, documenting what you would have seen had you been there, and also serving as an aid to one's memory. General Eisenhower was so shocked when he saw a liberated concentration camp that he ordered photographs to be taken to verify the horrors, thinking that people would not otherwise believe what had taken place. Unfortunately, with the rise of Holocaust denial, Eisenhower was right. And as Ross later stated, just before the closure of the ghetto, I buried my negatives in the ground in order that there should be some record of our tragedy, namely the total elimination of the Jews by Nazi executioners. I was anticipating the total destruction of Polish Jewry. I wanted to leave a historical record of our martyrdom. The conditions under which Ross made his pictures are unnerving because they retell the side of human nature that many of us don't want to acknowledge. The economic and social status of the ghetto and how it there were still the have-nots. These circumstances were compounded by the burden of survivors' guilt, which resulted in many people not wanting to talk about what had happened, believing that the finest had perished. Ross himself was traumatized and never really found solid footing after the Shoah. The complicated and stressful circumstances surrounding Ross's archive and its revised interpretations circles back to the Wild Things exhibition's premise. How photographs are understood over time is very slippery, and it depends upon the time, the place, and the background of each viewer. The Eichmann trial had a similar effect. It was a great awakening for many people, including myself, who learned the details of the Holocaust for the first time. The trial gave names, faces, and histories of the Holocaust victims, asserting its human dimension. After the trial, more survivors decided that they did not want to be inhumane creatures who were acted upon. Instead, they took up personal agency and began telling their stories. Also, it showed the importance of the existence of the state of Israel. Had there been a Jewish state, it could have provided an escape hatch. The aftermath of the Eichmann trial marked the expansion of investigative Holocaust scholarship, which in turn has broadened how Ross's photographs have been appraised. Like a revolving door of goodness and horror, the duality of Ross's disturbing photographs juxtaposes beauty and hope in the midst of calamity and despair. Now we consider them a form of social photographic verite, which chronicled people in everyday situations under dire and nerve-wracking conditions. Ross's complex photographs make a case against fatalism that attempted to erase Jewish culture from the collective memory. Rather than succumbing to despair in a desperate situation, Ross practiced resistance. His work shows the human agency in what otherwise would have been an abstract numerical horror story. His archive is like an iceberg. It has cumulative power that lays below the surface and acts as an anthology of collected trauma. Ultimately, the sheer number of Ross's surviving photographic archive of competing forces serves as a humanistic expression of rebellious disobedience, demonstrating how imperfect people can accomplish remarkable things. And lastly, it is a stark reassessment that remembrance without concrete personal action will not honor the Jewish precept of trying to heal the world. And for anyone who might be interested, the photographs that were shown at CEPA are available for sale for the low price of $50 US, and can be arranged by contacting either CEPA or the JCC. So I think I'm wrapped up here.
Okay, so you can hit stop screen share. Oh, I think she did it for you.
Gotcha. Thank you, Bob. So for our final portion of the presentation, before we go to the Q&A, we have our presenter is Dr. Sean Kelly. So we're changing a little bit from focusing so much on the photographers themselves. Dr. Kelly is a professor of philosophy and religious studies and department chair at Daemen College. His current teaching areas include interreligious dialogue, the Holocaust, and comparative genocide studies. So we thought it would be interesting to round out our presentation, kind of just talking a little bit about how we use photography in teaching the Holocaust and just the different effects with memory that these images can have. So I will turn it over to you, Dr. Kelly. One last thing, I just also want to remind everybody, we will do a brief Q&A after Dr. Kelly speaks. So if you have any questions, please feel free to be sending them right in the chat on YouTube. Thanks.
Well, thank you, everybody. I hope you can see my my slideshow, and let me click a couple of buttons here and try and get this up and running. What I wanted to talk about today was when I teach on the Holocaust, how it is that I think about memory and how I think about, or have asked the students to think about memory and photography, and where I find memory and photography helpful. So just a couple things about myself. My background is not in modern studies in the Holocaust or photography, but I'm a biblical scholar by training, and I write about genocide in the ancient world, and I've written about anti-Semitism in my field of New Testament studies. So long ago, when I first started working in these areas, I developed a Holocaust course that I've taught at Daemen College since the early 90s as a way of making sure I had a good grounding in the scholarship of the Holocaust. So really what I would want to be talking about today is how it is that I talk about this material in class, more how my students are responding to it, what I find effective, and so on. So how is it that I can teach memory of the Holocaust, and where does memory and photography play a role in it? So that's what I want to focus on today. So where do I emphasize memory in class, photography, and so on? So I divide the class in half, and in the first part of the semester, the first half of the semester, it's large historical questions: eugenics, anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic laws, the death camps, and so on. For this part of the semester, I'm really relying on major scholarly themes, but I find if I can use memory or if I can use visuals, extremely helpful, but mostly for illustrating so that students can get a grasp of what's going on. So maps, quotations from diaries that scholars bring up if I want students to understand what's happening, say, right when Hitler gets into power in 1933, diaries are extremely helpful. And propaganda photographs and propaganda posters are extremely helpful for getting students to understand anti-Semitism and so on. But I would say for the first half of the semester, when I'm looking at broad themes, it really is illustrative more than anything else. The second half of the semester is personal. And really for perpetrators, what did they do and why did they do it? And how do we understand their motives and their actions? For survivors, what did they do? And how do we understand the experience for them, whether they died during the war, for victims during the war, and for people who survived afterwards. So the second half of the semester, I'm really trying to get at individual experiences and individual motivation. So in that, I would say that memory is extremely important, But I also try and stress to the student that it's really anything but simple. And if we just, for the sake of conversation, divide it between perpetrators and survivors and think about memory as essential, but something that needs to be thought of critically, I take a very different approach to the memory of perpetrators than I do the memory of survivors. And there's obvious reasons why you have to be extremely cautious in listening to a perpetrator after the war explain what he or she did and why they did it. But I think it's, for the class, really essential to think about what perpetrators are saying about their actions. And in some ways, photography can end up being one of many tools that I use to try and get students to look at perpetrators and survivors' motives from different angles. I was going to talk a bit about survivors and about ghettos, but there's been a lot of discussion today with these really excellent and really fascinating presentations about life in the ghetto. So I'll just say a minute about memory and perpetrators, and I'll refer to an essay by Primo Levi. Primo Levi is a Holocaust survivor and has written really one of the most important accounts of his experience in Auschwitz, and then wrote a series of very searing essays right before his death in the 80s. And in one of those essays, he talks about the memory of the offense from a collection of essays called The Drowned and the Saved. And he describes memory as a marvelous instrument, but a fallacious instrument, and one that can easily have false memories. It could be because of trauma, it could be because of repression, it could be because of competing memories, particularly if the event is extremely traumatic. And so he starts talking about how memory for both perpetrators and victims is something that's very important, but needs to be thought about critically or carefully. And I found this quotation really quite helpful here. An apology is in order. This very book is drenched in memory. What's more, a distant memory. So he's writing this in the 80s about events from the 40s. From a suspect source and must be protected against itself. As for my personal memories, so he's describing other people's memories as well as his own. As for my personal memories, I have diligently examined them all. Time has somewhat faded them, but they are in good consonance with their background and seem to me unaffected by the drifting I have described. So one of the things that I try and get students to think about is, as we're examining people's memory of the events, that for different reasons for survivors and perpetrators, but we need to have a critical eye on it. So when we think about what sorts of things people want to remember and how the memory might get shaped, people's memory might be affected by trauma. Some events might be too painful to talk about. They may have done some things they regret and don't want to acknowledge to themselves or others. They may have experiences that is especially humiliating and not want to discuss it. So those are things that sort of immediately jump to mind. But also, I think it's important to recognize that memory can be influenced by public versions of events. If a particular narrative becomes public, that can affect the way people remember it. I'll just give one example of this. If you went to Auschwitz, you passed a doctor who selected you to tell you whether you would live or die. At that moment, many of the survivors wouldn't have known that was a doctor, wouldn't have known it was a selection, and wouldn't have known who the doctor was. And many of the early accounts of the doctors are kind of generic. This is from Levy's own account. A dozen SS men stood around, legs akimbo, with an indifferent air. Everything was silent as an aquarium, or as in certain dream sequences. We had expected something more apocalyptic. Now, in later accounts, people tend to remember that it was a doctor, but also specifically remember that it was Dr. Mengele. And I'm certainly not in any way trying to cast aspersions on the memory of survivors. That's the last thing I'm interested in doing. But I do think it is interesting to note that once Dr. Mengele became a very public figure, as the doctor in Auschwitz who was doing selections, it would be easy if you've seen this picture in newspapers and so on, and you had only a couple of seconds before him 25 years ago to have your memory shaped by this infamous public figure. So I would say that thinking about memory of past traumatic events, I try and emphasize to the students that can be highly malleable, but also really quite significant windows. So I'm not saying, I try and set this up for the students as this is important for us to think about as we begin examining the memories. Now, when we think about perpetrators, the reasons their memories are untrustworthy are really quite different. First of all, we need to acknowledge that perpetrators, when talking about their actions, lie like crazy in the face of overwhelming evidence. Lie about what they did, lie about what they knew, lie about their motives. And Primo Levi makes the interesting point that you could argue that the entire Third Reich is a war against memory and a falsification of reality. So there's a lot of factors why we have to be extremely critical when thinking about the memory of the perpetrators. So I want to talk about a couple of the memories of perpetrators that I use in class and where photography can provide sort of a helpful window or check on it. And just very briefly, I'm referring to the book Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning and the film Shoah. And the book Ordinary Men very self-consciously uses photos from 1942 and 43 of the unit. And the film Shoah self-consciously does not. So how is it that photography works out in one instance or another? And I'm looking at the time, so I'm going to focus more on Ordinary Men. But for example, how can we get a critical window into the memories of perpetrators, especially if we assume that much of what they're saying is untrustworthy, that they're lying intentionally for a variety of reasons to avoid prison, but also to avoid having to admit in public to themselves and to others terrible things that they've done. So how can photography and what we know from the time period be helpful? So what Browning does is he tries to use, this is for a police battalion that went into Poland and rounded up Jews in ghettos and shot some in mass shootings and mostly sent Jews to their death. So if we're thinking about the ghettos that were shown in the photographies here, this unit of German men would come to the ghetto and round everybody up and either shoot them or put them on trains and send them to Treblinka probably, or one of the other camps. So the men in this unit say they didn't know what they were getting into. That's often a lie, but that can be double checked. In this instance, there might be some truth to it. But the author has examples of lots and lots and lots of interviews with these men. And so one of the things he tries to do is compare what one man says about an account to another. And if we have multiple accounts of the same event, then Browning would say, well, that probably happened. So for example, the men all remember that the first day they were given orders to do a mass shooting, their major trap was weeping when he gave the orders. So there seems to be enough evidence to say, well, that's probably reasonable, a reasonable memory. There's also, even though the details are quite different, a lot of memory about the first massacre compared to the second massacre and how much easier the second massacre was, even though it was only a couple of days later. So the author finds that extremely helpful. You can also examine the language of what the men are saying. There are some really rather horrifying rationalizations that the men put forth that I find helpful, not as explanations of behavior, but helping to understand the motives of perpetrators. For example, one man was asked how he could shoot young children, and he said, well, he would shoot the mother first, because then he could say to himself, well, it's easier to do that, and then the poor child can't live without a mother. So it's clearly a horrible rationalization, but it is something I try and get the students to focus in on. Like, what is that revealing about the mindset. We also pay attention to minimizing language, not using the language of kill, using language of mercy shot, that kind of thing, as again, an insight into how people can carry out these kind of actions, which is the question I really want the class to be thinking about. A couple other things that I try and point out is that there is a great deal of minimizing of gratuitous violence and sadism in the personal accounts. We know from the evidence that lots and lots of this occurred, that sadistic enough to murder people, but there was a lot of gratuitous violence as part of these actions. And we know for sure that these men, when they're describing it, never talk about that and never acknowledge it. There's almost a total admission of sexual assault, although we know that some of that occurred as well. So I try and get the students to think about why it is that there's a downplaying of these sorts of things in the people's memories. And maybe something we could talk about if time is there. What are people willing to acknowledge, even when they're being rather forthright? And what's stunning about the book Ordinary Men is how forthright they are. Another interesting omission is that on the first mass shooting, the policy was to shoot the elderly and infants. Nobody acknowledges the shooting of infants on the first day. No, it was policy, it had to occur. There obviously were children in the village. And the men in the units seemed to more or less say, well, I guess it was just one of those villages that didn't have any children in it, which really doesn't make any sense. But I think it's a revealing omission. The mind frame is really what I'm trying to get students to look at. But one of the other things that's very important, and this is what I want to do as I sort of get this back to the conversation earlier, is that there is a fair amount of photographic evidence of this unit, pictures that they took themselves and that are available after the war and that the author had access to. And one of the things that it can do is we spend a fair amount of time in class saying, all right, how are they presenting what they did and why? And they're really presenting themselves as cogs in a machine who got efficient, but that didn't enjoy it and had no particular animosity and committed did nothing outside of what they were ordered to do. That maybe there were a few men in the units who were particularly violent, and there's a couple they always identify as particularly atrocious, but I was just basically a decent person, a cog in a machine. There had been earlier mention of the Eichmann trial, and that was the basic defense there as well. But the photographic evidence that they themselves took is interesting. This is from one of the first roundups, and we see here them rounding up in the same ghetto, and this is about 3 or 4 months in. And if you've seen the book, this is the cover of the book, and you can see the German men smiling, and you can see really the sense of superiority in the staging of this picture, the sense of domination in the staging of this picture. And I try and get our students to think a little bit about how these pictures shed a very different light on the events. And there's also a picture of a woman at a dressing station, and there's a number of these in the book, which is obviously another way of really kind of a grotesque form of superiority. And then this is not from the book, but I found it from the internet, but it seems to be a Christmas party of these men toasting, Christmas or the New Year, and they don't seem to be weighed down by the troubles of the year. Let's leave it at that. I want to end with one final example that I think is interesting. Looking at the clock, and I'm probably going over, so I apologize for that. But there's one particular memory that the men talk about a great deal, and there is a captain named Wolof who was kind of a ne'er-do-well until he finally threw himself into Nazism and was a real gung-ho kind of leader of the unit of drafted men who weren't terribly enthusiastic about their work. And he got his girlfriend pregnant, and this relates back to the story, and left. They got immediately married. And what's interesting is his wife, Vera, came back with him as they were carrying out this rather gruesome activity. Now, the men in the unit all remember this in great detail and with great horror, and this is why I want to pay attention to it. There were women who did come to the unit, and some of the wives of the officers, and occasionally they were entertainers, but they really didn't go to the realms where the men were carrying out these actions, the roundups and so on. But Vera Wolof did, and the men remember this in really great significance. They remember how eager she was to come and witness this, and when her husband was there, how enthusiastic he was and how he was showing off to her. And the men were outraged by her presence because there was a woman in this space that was sort of them and the men doing this dirty job. But they also remember, in particular, because she was pregnant. And there's been a lot of analysis and discussion of why the men reacted the way they did with such horror to the presence of a pregnant woman in this action. And here's some of the reasons for it. I apologize for going over, but in particular, a pregnant woman here seemed to be particularly horrifying. And it was enough of a problem that the major put out a policy. No more women, no more pregnant women can watch this. This is, we got to put a stop to this. The men were really, really outraged by this. But also what's interesting is they remember her as visibly pregnant. And here's a picture of her, and it was taken a couple of weeks before the event. And the question I would ask is she visibly pregnant? She and her husband got married almost right away as soon as it was discovered she was pregnant. This is from her marriage application, and then immediately she came out to visit him. And as we can see, she is clearly not pregnant. But her pregnancy played a role in the memory of both hers and of the men in the unit. And as time went on, they remembered her. Now, they probably saw her later when she was more visibly pregnant. They obviously know what a pregnant woman would look like. But this memory of her as visibly pregnant is something that I think gets at the question that I'm trying to have the students explore. The men's memory is more revealing to me for what it says about their mind process than for its accuracy or inaccuracy. In some ways, it doesn't matter whether she was 2 months pregnant or 5 months pregnant. But it does show something about how the telling and the retelling of a story can not only reflect faulty memory, but in some ways shape the memory. After the war, her husband was put on trial and was found guilty and did a little jail time from this case from the mid to late 60s. And she was put on trial or was at least asked about it by the investigators, because she acted in a way that really bothered the men. She wore an army coat, she had a whip, and she acted really dominant. And her self-defense always came back to the same thing about her pregnancy and so on. So I think it's an interesting example of how it is that the photographs from the time can bring an alternate perspective from the written testimony and from the spoken testimony from many years later, and can encourage my students and perhaps us to think a little differently about the events that are before us. So with that, I will stop and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly. I'm going to invite everybody, our other two presenters, back on screen for a brief Q&A. I have to say, I'm glad that this is going to be available on recording, because you all had such, your presentations are just full of so much information. I feel like I'm going to need to go back to just listen to it all again, because thank you. You've all put so much into today's presentation, so I appreciate it. So I'm going to wait a minute and just see if anything comes through on the questions from our audiences. But I did have one, if anyone or if all of you wanted to just speak on your thoughts about with Holocaust photography. Do you feel like you always need to have captions or put into context the images, or is there ever an appropriate time where you leave it so that it's more the viewer, I guess, being able to kind of come up with their own backstory with it? Anyone want to take that?
Well, I'll start. I think photographs are highly dependent on their context and how text that surrounds them affects the meaning. And generally, I would say that I would not expect an audience or viewers to be able to really know what's going on without some explanation.
Thanks.
I mean, I guess for me, it's always in the context of a class. And so, you know, this week we're covering Treblinka. So, you know, the context is pretty clearly set up by whatever the topic on the syllabus is for that week. So I can't, I think it'd be interesting sort of later in the semester when they had more background to give them different kinds of photographies without context and see what they thought about it. But I haven't ever done that. I've always used it sort of with the context of the class telling what we're covering that week or whatever it is.
Well, I can say about the context of the exhibition, and in the context of the exhibition, I don't think a caption is necessary to each and every photograph that is presented within the exhibition, but there needs to be some sort of framework for captionized framework for the photographs that are being shown within the exhibition or within the section of the exhibition. So there must be information somewhere of what is being presented in the photographs. It doesn't have to be directly connected with the visual with the photograph, but it has to be somewhere within the exhibition as a reference for the viewer.
Okay, thank you. What are your thoughts on specifically, like I guess in an exhibition, do you feel that you need to kind of mix in photographs that depict, you know, that maybe were from the perpetrators, and then, you know, I think it was an interesting presentation in that we had 3 different kind of photographers, if you will, or the images were taken by 3 individuals that played different roles or you know, were on different sides. Do you think that you need to have more than one view in an exhibit, or you know, what's the importance of showing some of those images that I don't remember which photographer it was, but where it was more of like almost the life before the images that, you know, didn't particularly, like almost showed them in a celebratory fashion?
Well, it was probably Walter Genevine. I wouldn't say that it was showing in celebratory fashion. Genevine is quite unique photographer because this is not a propaganda photography per se. It was made by a Nazi party official. It was made by someone who is on the side of perpetrators, but it wasn't really a propaganda photography if you compare Genevine's photography with the actual propaganda photographs taken by, I don't know, Wehrmacht propaganda unit, which really units which really show Jews in humiliating, very often in humiliating situation. I think it was very unique view of Genevine, very naive maybe it was a naive way of looking at what is happening in the ghetto. But to answer the question, I don't think you have to have both perspectives. It always depends on the exhibition. It always depends on what do you want to achieve with the set of the photographs. That's my view.
I think, I mean, it's good to have more information because, I mean, you get a wider perspective of how it's being seen and interpreted. And of course, a Nazi official would be able to take any kind of photographs that he or she wanted to, I mean, without, you know, much consequence. You know, on the other hand, I mean, like the Jewish photographers in the ghetto, I mean, were doing, you know, were prohibited, you know, from taking the unofficial photographs, and I mean, you know, risked everything by doing it. So I mean, you know, they have, you know, the perspective of the insider. So I mean, you know, one can be seen as, you know, one is, you know, from the inside, and the other, I mean, in a way, he's like a tourist. I mean, it's a horrible way to put it, but, you know, he's just, you know, passing through the ghetto, and, you know, he's an outsider. I mean, he doesn't have to contend with what the people in the ghetto were trying to deal with.
Thank you. Well, I'd just like to open it up. I know you guys all had a chance to kind of listen to each other as well. So if anybody has anything in closing, just about what anybody else spoke about that you'd like to add your input to or anything, I could open it to you guys. Otherwise, we're kind of light on the questions from our participants. I think you just gave them so much to absorb. Like I said, I'm kind of going to rewind and go back and listen to everything again for sure. But if anybody has anything that they'd like to finish off with, I'd like to open it up to you guys. No?
Well, I'd say one thing. I mean, I think, you know, that I mean, even though these events, you know, happened, I mean, before my lifetime began, you know, there's still much that's being, you know, discovered. You know, somehow, you know, we think that we already know all is. And this past week, I received a new book called The Ravine by a woman historian by the name of Lord. And she was able to find a few photographs taken by a Slovakian who witnessed some of the mass murders, and does like this incredible breakdown based on a few of the images, and how the images were eventually used to identify some of the murderers, who a few of them were actually brought, you know, to trial, convicted, and a few of them were actually this kind of, you know, these photographs again, you know, it's a complicated, you know, all these stories are complicated, but, you know, they, you know, these photographs, you know, were not available, you know, to historians until recently. And I think, you know, that they had, you know, were in, you know, there's still things, I think Sean had mentioned, you know, that things, you know, that were in, you know, people's personal collections. And I mean, so there's always new material surfacing. And I think that's, you know, the interesting thing for me, not just about this history, but I mean, all history. I mean, how it's constantly being rewritten and being re-understood as, you know, times change.
Thank you, Bob. I want to thank all of, did you want to
If
go
I
in
can
there?
add to this,
Go ahead.
the photographs are showing up, photographs are being found, the photographs are being discovered in libraries, on the attics of private homes. Every few years there's new book coming out with photographs discovered from this place, that place. Still, what is photographed and what is visible, what is there in the archives is just a fraction of what happened during the Holocaust, and there are still many places which we don't have any evidence, photographic evidence of, and not only of people, but of camps, of ghettos, of mass shootings, of so many things that happened. So really, what we know in terms of our visual knowledge is just a tip of an iceberg, and we can only imagine what wasn't photographed. So there's plenty of events that were never most likely photographed.
Yeah, and I think, just tagging on to what you're saying, I think it also shows, how over time Holocaust scholarship has changed, because at least from what is available in the States, so much of how things were analyzed and seen for years was really based on the Nazi documentation, and that personal accounts and personal archives, were considered to be, that, too many historians, didn't take them seriously. I think they, for, reasons, having to do with memory, that they, didn't want to take these accounts too seriously. But I think, that a lot of that, has changed, and, that these personal accounts now, shed a different light and add another dimension to the existing scholarship. And again, it just shows how the scholarship is, an evolving entity.
Well, thank you, guys. I want to thank you all again for joining us today. As I said, I think it was interesting that the three presentations put together really made for a very comprehensive program. So thank you again. Thank you to our partners that I mentioned in the beginning. We have Holocaust Resource Center, CEPA Gallery, Jewish Community Relations Council, Galicia Museum, and Daemen College, and made in part by Buffalo Jewish Federation. And of course, always thank you to our cultural arts sponsors. In closing, I just also want to mention that Holocaust Resource Center is this coming Sunday on April 11th at 11 a.m. They have a virtual Yom HaShoa Holocaust Remembrance Day program that they're presenting. It will feature keynote speaker Jim Klein, who's the son of Gerda Weissman Klein, a Holocaust survivor and author of All But My Life. So if you want to find out more about that information, you can go to the Buffalo Holocaust Resource Center website. And just encourage everybody to please continue to check the JCC website. We're continuing our virtual programming for now, with the hope that we'll be back to in-person soon. But we have our Buffalo International Jewish Film Festival starting actually within a film this weekend. We're showing 13 films virtually, so I encourage you to check out that website and get some tickets and participate. We have some really great films and then special events with some speakers as well lined up. So thank you all again. Have a wonderful afternoon. And of course, as what this event does, just the importance of remembering and sharing. And so, as I mentioned, this is recorded, share it with colleagues and friends and family. It's important to keep educating and remembering. So thank you all. Stay well.
Thank you.